So welcome everyone who has joined us for this public lecture this evening, which is part of the Arts and Humanities Research Council funded project Women's Grassroots Activism, which is looking at women's grassroots activism across England and Ireland from 1918 to the present. And this event is hosted by London South Bank University. My name's Professor Katrina Beaumont. I'm from London South Bank University, and I'm also the principal investigator for this project. We have huge pleasure in welcoming Dr. Sorcha O'Brien to give this public lecture as part of the AHRC Women's Grassroots Activism project. And Sorcha is a design historian with long-term interests, whose long-term interests are in the critical analysis of design and technology history in Ireland. She's a lecturer in design history and theory at the Institute of Art, Design and Technology in Dún Laoghaire in Dublin. And she is also an expert on the history of the ICA and its activism around design, electrification, and just being a wonderful organisation throughout the 50s and 60s in Ireland. And that's what she's going to be talking about today. So, Sorcha, I shall hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Kate. And thank you for inviting me to come and do this lecture. I'm delighted to be here. So yeah, as Kate said, one of the things I've been working on over in recent years is looking at rural electrification, and particularly women's experiences of rural electrification. And when I was still working in London and Kingston University, the project that I'm going to talk about today is an example of a project that's documenting part of the history of rural electrification and also the role of the ICA within that. And some of this is related to the AHRC project that Kate has been running about women's grassroots activism. But the project that I had originally done on this ran from 2016 to 19, also sponsored by and funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. But when I was working in Kingston University and then in partnership with the National Museum. But we've been talking in some of the earlier sessions about archives and the importance of archives and organizational archives and the power of objects and memories and narratives and oral histories within that. So part of really what I wanted to do today is look at this Kitchen Power project as an example of a project documenting, a historical moment in time, looking at the history of rural electrification, the role of the ICA in that, but also how you can collect around that and document it. And in this case, looking at women's activism, but also then looking at the projects, this particular project, which started off for me as a design history research project, but expanded out to become an exhibition in the National Museum of Ireland Country Life in Castlebar, but partly also using a lot of oral history, using an awful lot of objects, but then also becoming a textile art craftivism project. So what I want to do is talk about a little bit about the background of rural electrification. I'll talk about the ICA's role, and then I'll go on and talk about the textile art project or the craftivism project that we ran. Just in terms of these are, an example or an ideas of how this sort of history can be documented and then used as well. And I mean, from my point of view, I came at this having worked and done my PhD and then published this book on the Shannon scheme, where I was really interested in electricity in Ireland as a new technology in the 1920s, and looking at these ideas about modernization and about technology. How were they promoted, and how were they taken in Ireland in the 20s, where you had a new state, but one that was very oriented about the past, about the countryside, and not about, sort of urban high technology and modernity. And when I was doing this, one of the things that always struck me is that everybody I was talking about, this is very much about engineers, about engineering, about the world of work, of paid work outside the home, and the creation of electricity. And I got really interested in then following on from this, looking at how did this actually then come and into everyday life, how did it actually spread out into the rest of the state and the rest of people's daily lives? And because my background is a product designer, and at the time I was working with product and interior designers, I got really interested in looking at how does this actually come into the everyday, into domestic life? And Ireland being 1950s and 60s, this is very much looking at women's roles and women's lives at the time, with these ideas about women in the home. So a little bit of background here. The rural electrification scheme, for those who haven't got the background of it, started in the mid-1940s, ran for roughly 20 years. And the ESB had been set up in the 1920s to run the Shannon scheme power station. The ESB had been building other power stations then, and interrupted by the Second World War. But after the Second World War, then they're starting to look at how do we actually bring electricity to every house in the country. And the map on the right-hand side is from the ESB Archives, fantastic website. And what it's representing are the 792 areas that the ESB divided the state into, and then basically spent 20 years working through to electrify the country. And this was going on where a process where they were, first of all, arriving in, signing people up, then coming back a couple of years later and then electrifying the area, bringing in all, the poles, bringing the electricity to people's houses, to their, usually just inside the door, to the box inside the door. And it was the householder's responsibility then to get the house wired. So this is a rolling process that goes on over a very long period of time. And in some cases, you'll have a townland where they will have gotten electricity in the late 1940s. And people down in the next townland, it might not have arrived until 10 years later. So it's very gradual, but very comprehensive at the same time. And the other thing that I wanted to look at is looking at gender roles in post-war Ireland, where you're looking very much at a time where the article, the very quite recently contentious Article 41.2 of the Constitution, is not very long in force. It's got this emphasis about woman giving to the state support, and it's about life within the home. And it's something where now we're looking at it and it's talking basically about care work, but it's doing so in a very gendered fashion. And it's also it's very much the gender roles of the 1950s and the 1960s. But also as part of that, where you have woman in one paragraph then suddenly becomes mother, and the two things are almost as if they're exactly the same. And this is very much talking about, the gender roles and the ideas of the 50s and into the 60s, where you have somebody like the lady on the left here is Annie McStay, who was the housewife, who had won the Housewife of the Year competition in 1969, and was seen as a role model for having, running a household with 11 children in it. And this is very much what you're looking at, this whole idea about the home, but also about work. And this is something like, from looking at the Shannon scheme, I'm really interested in work and the visualization of work and how people treated it, working with different appliances. Where there's this weird thing where work in the home is often not seen as work, even though I would very much think it is. So that, coming at this material and going, what these women are doing is they're working, but they're working within the home. And it's not, it's not salaried work for outside the home, but it is still work. And those homes, particularly in rural Ireland, you're looking at an awful lot of the housing stock in this time period. It's not changed a huge amount from the middle of the 19th century. I mean, you're looking at it's not until the 1970s and the whole bungalow bliss that you start getting one-off bungalows being built in the Irish countryside. The standard sort of house at this time is the vernacular housing, where you have here, for example, is the example on the left from the National Museum, surviving into the 1970s, of a traditional cottage with a hearth fire, with turf on the hearth and shugan chairs and iron cookware. And the image on the right is from the 1940s as well, with similar drawings with the wooden furniture around the house. So there's things like the wood, tables, dressers, wooden benches, as well as the chairs, being a very much a very specific lifestyle, that where heating and lighting is very much focused around the fireplace and the hearth, but also then as well, you've got things like the use of maybe candles or gas lamps or oil lamps as well. But not changing very much over nearly 100 years until you get this big step change in the 50s and 60s, where it's an energy transition in contemporary terms, where people are moving from using fossil fuels like this in a lot of cases to using electricity for lighting rather than gas lamps or oil lamps. And so into this you have the ESB, where they're looking at selling electricity, but also selling appliances, so people use more electricity. But also they're looking at an awful lot of programs of education, where they're looking at where an awful lot of people don't know an awful lot about electricity. So they're looking at not just selling appliances or getting people signed up, but also then trying to see, helping people to understand what this is and how this works. So we've got some of the images here again from the ESB archives, where you've got salesman over here on the left-hand side selling appliances, cooker, a small cooker, a kettle, an iron, and a pamphlet over on the right-hand side, which is treat your kitchen to an electric kettle, with the electric kettle, and then the little model of the kitchen underneath with the very stylish housewife and what basically looks like a fitted kitchen as well. So this is quite aspirational. And the advertisements of the time are very much in this aspirational mode, where they're showing these young women who are very stylish. They've got up-to-date outfits. They've got the latest hairstyles, shoes. The woman on the right here is sitting very jauntily on top of a fridge, being terribly happy about the whole thing. And there's also this narrative that surrounds electricity from the late 19th century about it being clean and about cleanliness and about hygiene. And the whole idea being that it's so much cleaner than even a gas cooker or cooking over an open fire. And this is something that you see across Europe, you see it in the United States, you see it in all different parts in the world, in different parts of Asia and so on, around this idea about electricity, that it's clean and it's modern and it's up to date as well. And it's, being set up as being something that's really desirable. But it's also, with the appliances, they're very specifically marketed at a female audience, and a sort of, this is the ideal, is that sort of 20, 30 something female audience. And a lot of this then, the ESB were using, again, this idea about an aspirational figure, employing a whole group of electrical demonstrators over this time period, who were quite unusual, and they're mostly quite middle class. They've got third level education, usually in institutional management or in domestic science. And what they're doing is two different things. One is appearing in things like the Spring Show, where they're doing public demonstrations, where someone can walk up and say, show me how that kettle works, or ask questions. But also then as well, that if you bought something like a cooker from the ESB, it would come and be installed, and then maybe a week or so later, the demonstrator would call and cook something standard, like some brown bread or scones. And officially it was to check that the cooker was working, but in reality it was very much to check that the woman of the house was comfortable with this and understood how the whole thing worked. And they're a really interesting group of women, because they're female technical experts in an area where the sort of engineering is usually almost all, certainly in this time period, is seen as being a male role. But they're female technical experts about domestic technology, so that's seen as being acceptable because it's domestic. And they're seen as being very, very stylish. They've got quite a large salary for the time. They all have cars. They have these, here they've got the left, they've got white coats, but a lot of the time they had uniforms that were designed by Irish designers in like turquoise and teal and so on. And have been compared to air hostesses. I've heard people comparing them. So they're very stylish from that point of view and aspirational. And the idea is that this is who comes into your house and shows you with confidence how to use your electric cooker and, you know, the dials on it and the temperature settings, and it helps instill confidence. And one of the things about this whole introduction of electricity and this, how it's actually rolling into people's homes, this idea about romance and reality is something that the National Museum in Castlebar Country Life section use as part of their introductions. In the introductory sections, they're talking about the idea of the romance and the reality of the countryside. So that on the one hand, countryside is being, you know, there's a whole romance about the Irish countryside, but the reality of living in the countryside, certainly in the period they're looking at, they're talking about late 19th century, early 20th century, is very, very harsh. And I think there's something similar going on here, where you have all of these advertisements and all of these material where it's, you know, you can have this fitted kitchen, it's out of a dream, but it's not out of the question. This is very, very much aspirational. And what I've been finding is what you get in people's houses is something a lot more hybrid, like the photograph on the right, where this is Mrs. Bridget O'Grady, where the photograph has been taken because she's using a dash churn in her kitchen by the museum. But I was looking at it from the point of view of what's going on in the background, where there's a combination of traditional interiors with painted woodwork, there's wooden furniture, there's small, you know, the shelf, and then the new appliances have been added in. You know, there's a television on the cabinet, there's a GC cooker over on the right hand side, there's an older model of a radio on the shelf, and it's this sort of hybrid combination of the two things, both old and new appliances, but in the older building and the older interior. And part of this is what I've been really interested in looking at, is the reactions of people to electricity and the reactions of the women who were housewives at the time. And part of this is we did a oral history project where we interviewed over 50 women who had been housewives in the 50s and 60s. And part of this is getting those reactions from the point of view of what do you remember? What was it like being a housewife in this time period, and how do people react to it? And it's quite different to a lot of the reactions are quite gendered, where a lot of men were, especially farmers, weren't anywhere near as keen on electricity as the women of Ireland seem to have been. And I'll just play the clip here from Maureen in Monaghan.
It left everybody, I think, happy.
Yeah.
Because it took the drudgery out of all the hard work, you know, that people had to do. Like, you couldn't believe, like, I can always remember my mother saying, oh, she says, I think this is heaven. She says, this has to be heaven. She loved it. She loved it.
And one of the things about sort of oral history and using oral history and design history and objects is you get into those reactions and those emotions, which is really, really useful. And it gets you into a story beyond the official story and the sort of the official governmental level. So with that in mind, what I want to do is talk about the Irish Countrywomen's Association role in all of this. And part of this is, I'm not going to go into the whole history of the Irish Countrywomen's Association because I think a lot of the attendees here are already members, but the Irish Countrywomen's Association starts up in the early 20th century. It's very much, I think, the remit is about trying to improve the lives of women in the countryside through whatever means is available at a particular time. And they're very much rowing in behind the ESB with rural electrification for its own reasons, also because it's supporting a rural water project as well, and it's allowing people to buy electric pumps and bring running water into houses across the state, as well as electricity and electric lights and appliances. And one of the things about this is you've got this very strong set of collaborations between the ESB, the ICA, and then several other organizations as well, where they're doing lots of work together. So the demonstrators are coming to ICA Guild meetings, they're doing demonstrations for the members across the state, but also then you have things like on Grianon, the adult education college in Termonfeckin in County Louth. Once that is opened up in the late 1950s, they're starting to run residential courses. The ICA is starting to run residential courses there for their members. And this demonstration kitchen was opened up in the late 1950s to facilitate that, and particularly to facilitate domestic science courses. And then later on, sort of you head towards the late 60s and into the 70s, they're running courses about how to run a B&B in your house if you've got, you know, 2 or 3 spare bedrooms. But an awful lot of this is based on the use of electrical appliances. So electric cooker, electric kettle, iron washing machine, and so on. And it's a really interesting interior, because it's a very intentional combination of tradition and modernity. So there's all this sort of modern things, or there's a very modern color schemes. An awful lot of it is white. There's the orange doorway, the blue tables, but also lots and lots of formica. So this is a really new material of the 1950s, very seen as being very modern. But at the same time, if you look into the background here, there's the rounded, you know, the rounded edge on the cabinets here, but the shelving at the back they're all set up in the same proportions as traditional dressers. There's a fireplace that you can't see in this particular photograph with a mantelpiece on it. It's got a Bridget's cross and all sorts of things on it. But these are mixed in, you know, next to an electric cooker. So there's the adult classes. They also ran these 6-week courses that were for girls who had just left or were leaving school. And this is a certificate from Connie McAvoy, who we interviewed, who had done one of these courses in the 1950s, where it's a 6-week residential course covering all sorts of what I guess you call domestic science or home economics. So cooking, laundering, housekeeping, poultry keeping, dairying, gardening, dressmaking, and handicraft. So covering this entire spectrum. And you have things like housecraft advisors coming to work for the ICA and, you know, doing things like running these courses. And one of them, particularly Eleanor Butler, who's a really interesting figure in herself, in her own right, who was an architect, later married to the Earl of Wicklow, was also a Labour Party politician. And she spent several years working for the ICA as a domestic science advisor and housing advisor. So one of the things that she was doing, first of all, she went on a tour. They sent on a tour of mostly Northern Europe to look at rural housing and farm housing. And one of the things that came out of this was this model kitchen that was done by the ESB, the ICA, the Royal Institute of Architects of Ireland, and the Department of Agriculture in the Spring Show in the RDS in 1956. And it's got a very similar thing going on here, where it's got this dresser analog in the background in the middle of the black and white photograph there, but it's also got the curved cabinets. It's got the formica, but it's got, you know, striped blue ceramics. It's got electric kettles, all mixed in together. And you can see it as an example on the right, the photograph on the right hand side is a reconstruction of this that we did in the Kitchen Power in the exhibition that was open in the National Museum with Letterfrack Furniture College as part of ATU now. And we had a final year student, Philip Carey, who worked with me, and we designed, and he built it. And one of the things that was interesting about this is we never knew what color it was. We were looking at black and white photographs, and it was never mentioned in any of the articles or any of the material what color this kitchen was. And so I did some research on it and found that it had been in the Spring Show. It had then been installed in a van where it had been driven around the country for about 4 or 5 years as a demonstration van. And at the end of that part of its life, it actually was donated to the ICA to one of the guilds down near Portlaoise, where it was installed in their hall, and it remained for a number of years. And when I got in contact with them, they were able to actually tell me that it was green and cream, and which is what we used for the color scheme for it. But it's this whole thing about this coordination between all of these different groups, trying to negotiate these ideas about, we want something that's a farm kitchen that you can put into a farmhouse, but it's going to also be modern and bringing in ideas from, particularly from Europe, but also from Northern America, about efficiency and, or, you know, how you actually lay out and organize a kitchen. This one is also rather interesting because it seemed to have been really successful at the time, but wasn't copied a lot. This is a pilot kitchen in Drimoleague in Cork, where we actually interviewed this Humphrey O'Leary. We interviewed his Mary O'Leary for the project, where the idea with this was that the O'Learys were a newly married couple. They had just built a house, and the idea is the ESB provided them with all the appliances, like all mod cons, literally, for this kitchen. And in return, there was an instructor from the Munster Institute came on a Tuesday and a Thursday night for 2 years and ran classes for local women about cooking, about housekeeping, and so on. And after the end of the 2 years, the O'Learys got to keep the kitchen. And it was apparently really successful, but in a very local way. And it's quite interesting. You guys probably can't read the newspaper article, but there's a box in it saying that this is such a fantastic project, and this should be rolled out all the way over across Ireland. But I suspected that it's just in terms of the logistics and finding someone who's willing to have 25 of their neighbours come in twice a week for 2 years might be a little bit harder. But it's this whole idea about collaboration is really, really important and really, really relevant. And as well as the official setup, the official or the collaborations, what I think is really interesting here as well is the more grassroots part of it, where you have these official things in the ICA, but also then what's going on behind the scenes and what's going on at the grassroots. And part of the project, Geraldine interviewed the late Maimo McDonald, who's probably known to any ICA members as being a past president. And I'm just going to play a clip from Maimo about this, explaining about the courses on Green On, but also what's going on behind the scenes at the grassroots.
And men were keen to get it into the farmyard, into the
Yes,
byre.
quite happy to get it. It would be very useful in the byre to get a light in.
Right.
But they'd think about it into the house. Maybe a light in the kitchen. But they certainly wouldn't, the idea of electrifying your house and putting in, they weren't on for that.
Right.
They were kind of dragged into it and inveigled into it. Well, you see, by coming up to, you were getting a cross-section of women from all around the country at the Adult Education College at Greenon.
Yes.
And the women were coming, and a lot of them, their first holiday away would be coming up to Greenon to do a course, and there was no problem about filling courses that time.
Yeah.
And
the young women?
The women, they loved just coming there. And then they were going home as disciples because they saw, all this.
Were the girls encouraged to hold back from getting married? Is there a
Yes,
story
they
to
were.
that?
Yeah, that was the perceived that we were telling the young members, the unmarried ones, not to marry a farmer unless he put in the electricity for you in the house and had water on tap.
which I think is really interesting, because it is very much that grassroots of older, you know, the older women who were involved in the organization, involved in supporting the rural electrification scheme, looking at their members and going, if you're a young woman in the countryside in, you know, the 50s in Ireland, you have very little power. But one of the things that these young women would have had was the power to say yes or no to a proposal, or to negotiate for, as the terms of it, to be able to go and say, well, you know, okay, I will marry you, but only if you put electricity into the house when it's available, or if it is available, put it in, and then we'll talk. So this is very much this whole idea of, you know, this is what's going on at the grassroots. Yeah. So the other thing I want to talk a little bit about was just about the power of objects, and in terms of meaning, where this is the whole idea about material culture again, that I found was really important, and it got really engaging with the exhibition because of the role of objects, of people being able to go in and see something and go, oh, I used to have one of those in my house. What did it mean to me? And what's one of the things that was interesting about the exhibition is that about a third of it was objects that were already in the National Museum collection. About a third of it was objects that came from the ESB archives, but the other third was all objects that people were loaning to it, including this, if anybody had seen this was at the exhibition, saw this yellow iron. This is from Tom Spalding. It's his mother's iron that she had kept, and then he had kept as well, as a memento, as you know, associated with the memory of her. And it's you know, it's Morphy Richards. It's made in England but sold in Ireland, this particular one, with this very lovely sort of primrose yellow, and they currently came in a range of pastel colors. But also as well, over on the right hand side, you have the display from the exhibition from Mary Lyons' bread baking trophy and the apron and sash, where she had competed in the school's bread baking competition in the late 1960s, and had represented Mayo at the national final in Dublin. And you've not only kept the plaque or her trophy, but kept the apron and then the sash with County Mayo on it. So this very, very visceral piece of, you know, object, piece of textiles, and then piece of what was actually, the sash is actually kind of a type of plastic, kept for decades because of that, you know, the memories of that experience of going up to Dublin, baking bread on a stage in the Abbey Theatre, and you know, competing for Mayo. That was really, you know, a formative teenage experience. So it's all these sort of things, you know, the power of objects to spark memories is really important. And a lot of it is about this idea of trying to moving out of the drudgery, where, you know, there's an awful lot of nostalgia around in some parts of pre-electric life. And one of the things I keep coming across is people being nostalgic for baking and bread baked on an open fire. You've got Kathleen McQuillan here as well, talking about the lovely bread. And this is something that comes up again and again as people talking about lovely bread and being really nostalgic for it. But on the other hand, then you have people talking about, once you start talking about washing, something like clothes washing, that nostalgia.
And I well remember my mother had a small little white can, and she'd put a pint or two of milk to one side in that little can to curdle and thicken, and that made lovely bread.
Right.
She put it in a round oven, a good big oven near a foot wide with a lid on it.
Yes.
And she'd lift the turf coals out with a pair of tongs and put the coals on top of the lid and give it half an hour, maybe a little more, and the lovely brown cake would tumble out of the oven.
Lovely. Homemade bread.
Homemade bread, and it was lovely.
So this is the whole thing. You've got all of that nostalgia, but once you start talking about washing, there's no more nostalgia at all, you know. And this is part of, I'm not going to play a clip here because it's longer, but Marianne Egan talking about having 4 babies in nappies at the same time in the middle of the winter. and one of her relatives buying her one of these flatly dryers, which is basically, it's a drying rack in a cabinet with an electrical element under it. And she's talking about it as being a godsend because we'd worked out something, 6 nappies a day for babies. That's an awful lot of very heavy nappies to try and wash, and particularly to dry as well when you can't put them out on a line. And there's this whole thing about drudgery continuously coming up, and it comes up all the time, about just the sheer drudgery involved in housework being very, very memorable, but not in a particularly good way. And this is the thing that I found with these objects, is that there are different objects provide different sorts of, they spark different sorts of memories, some of them more positive than others, but all quite strong and quite important to document as well. Which brings me in, I'm talking about memories and narratives and the idea about doing oral histories, that what we had done for this was we'd gone around the countryside working, starting off with the National Museum. We'd gotten some written testimony about oral histories, about rural electrification. And then we went out and started doing interviews. And I know there's several of the people who are in the audience here today who were involved in this, going out and largely with the ICA, going and interviewing people. I mean, I went up to Clonus, and Geraldine, who's there sitting beside me, did the interviews up in Clonus, including several of the members, including the late Mamo and the late Dan Kerr, who's here on the right hand side, who wasn't a member of the ICA, but who was at the time the oldest man in Clonus, probably the oldest person in Clonus, and had worked for the ESB in the 1960s. So he had a slightly different perspective on it, which was really useful. And then a newspaper article down in Cork, West Cork, with Bridget O'Brien at a ICA meeting there. And this project is, I mean, it's really interesting. It's this whole idea about looking at oral histories. What can be captured? What can you record about people's memories, whether it's nostalgic or not? It's really, really important and really central to capturing things that don't get captured in official narratives, in, paper archives or even photographs, and I'll just play this one from Josephine to give you a sense of the sort of emotional reactions to electricity.
I have great memories of turning on that one switch and seeing light. It was such a wonderful thing. We never, even though they were crude looking when we think about them now, to turn it on. But everything seemed dirty when you turned on the light. The light was so good in comparison to what we had before.
And one of the things about this, it's this whole idea of, this fascination of turning on this light. But part of this is what she's signposting here, is the wave of interior decoration that went across the country, where people were getting a 50-watt bulb into a room which might have only been lit with oil lamp or gas lamp before that, and realizing how the soot or the dirt from those lamps on the corners of the room, and basically going, we're going to have to clean everything and probably repaint it as a result.
I have great...
And the other thing about oral histories is what you get is people's own opinions on the subject and people's own perspectives. And this is part of one of the first interviews that we'd done with Maura McGuinness, interviewed by Mary O'Reilly in Castlebar, talking about this whole idea of, looking back at this from our point of view in 2016.
Well, anything else you'd like to add to that now, Maura?
I don't think so. I think that if anyone that's under 50 now heard me talking, they'd be saying, well, that one must be 100 years old.
That one must be living in the dark ages.
Yeah, but those things could never have happened. That really they didn't.
Well, do you think it's better for them ones now that never went through any hardship and grew up just with the flick of a switch everywhere? And
well, I suppose it's better for them, Mary, but this is why I suppose they weren't able to cope with the recession as well as people of my age, because we were reared with not having
Yeah, we
a
remember.
lot, and we appreciated what we had, whereas the young people are born with it and they find it very hard to accept if
There's a go slow
if
anywhere.
there is a go slow
Yeah.
for them. Yeah.
You know, so that perspective is really interesting, having seen both sides before rural electrification and then afterwards. And also it's really interesting looking at this now as well, in the context of, you know, this was done in 2016, and in 2020 you have the COVID pandemic starting and lockdowns, and what's literally, you know, a different go slow rather than a purely economic one. So it gives you a slightly different perspective on it based on what's happened since. And, you know, look, the relevance of what Maura is saying there is really important. So then just going on to talking about a little bit about the Kitchen Power exhibition, but more about Craftivism. And I mean, this exhibition, it ran for, in total, about 1.5 years in the museum. Some of that was interrupted by some of the level 5 lockdowns where the museum was closed, but we were very lucky. This is a photograph from the opening. We were very lucky to have Mary Robinson open it, but with Bridget O'Brien there beside me and Noreen Durkin from the ICA as well. There is a website there which is on the museum website, where there's a whole load of material around it there. But what I wanted to talk about was this whole thing about the exhibition being about objects and all those sort of things that I was just talking about in terms of objects and the reactions of people to those objects. We had, one of the things about it is we had a certain amount of issue where with people coming in seeing so much, you know, you're trained to not touch things in a museum. They're usually behind a glass cabinet, but a lot of these are things that people had in their houses. So there's this ongoing issue about, you know, getting people to not touch. There was one of the particular washing machines that everybody wanted to touch because it was really familiar. But part of this, we did a textile art project that with Age and Opportunity, who helped us based on, I mean, they'd run a number of projects before with community-based art projects, a lot of which were based on things like printmaking. And the one I had looked at as a model for this was using Rathfarnham Castle, where they went in and looked at all the stucco work and the decoration in Rathfarnham Castle and did a whole load of printmaking with it. But one of the things about this, we were talking about doing this early on, and every time we were doing the interviews and we asked somebody, if you got electricity into the house and you got, say, a washing machine, what did you do instead? So if you weren't having to spend all day doing the laundry and on Monday and then all day on Tuesday ironing beside the fire, what were you doing with the time? And the two things that people were saying were spending more time with the kids, if they had kids, and then spending time doing textile work. So knitting, crocheting, sewing. And to me, that made perfect sense to do a textile project, not to start going into more traditional printmaking or even sculpture or anything like that, or painting, but to use textile as a medium. And this was really, you know, it got really interesting because we recruited the people for this from Castlebar ICA and from the National Museum in Castlebar. Had a knitting and crochet circle. So that was the group of people that we were recruiting for this. And this is the first workshop that we did in Ungrianon with Anna Spearman, who's here, with her back to the camera in grey there. But the idea behind this being looking at their memories and everyone's experiences, and then start trying to translate this into textile form. And a lot of it is because a lot of the participants in this has amazing skills in textiles, but we're very, very used to following patterns and having a class where you had a very defined output of what you were actually making. Whereas what we were doing here was something much more like we do in first year in art college, where you're trying to loosen people up from the leaving cert and get used to thinking about sort of shape and color and form in a looser fashion and more experimental. And an awful lot about this was this sort of giving people space to be more experimental with it, and to tell their own, use it as a medium to tell their own stories as well. And so I'm going to go into the next slide, and I've got a 2-minute video that we made, that was made about the project and then was installed along with all of the work in the exhibition. So I'm just going to play this one for everybody. I had already done research about the Shannon scheme and about electricity in Ireland in the 1920s and 30s. I was really interested in the objects and really what effect did this have on women's everyday life.
To commission a number of artists to consider interesting ideas about how they might approach creating something collaboratively with the local community in Mayo, because obviously the Museum of Country Life was a core partner in this initiative, and the artist Anna Spearman was selected. So Anna has a huge experience working with groups as well as being an independent artist in her own right, but she's a very skilled practitioner in terms of working with other people.
I guess the challenge is to try and kind of draw out those individual voices, and for me that is really the joy of doing this kind of work.
From the beginning, Anna and ourselves wanted this project to be relevant. We wanted it to be inclusive and for the group to have ownership of this project.
Part of the project was doing an oral history project, interviewing women who were housewives in the 1950s and the 1960s. Not just be looking at the official story, not just be looking at what's the official view, but also to talk to people who are there and this is their lived experience. What did they think of the whole thing?
People are very afraid of it when it came, because some people are afraid of their houses getting burnt, and other people were afraid that they wouldn't be able to pay for the electricity because they weren't used to having bills. It was the single best thing ever happened to rural women, I would say.
I really enjoyed the experience of doing the project with Anna. I really went into the project in a big way, and I participated in most things, and I really enjoyed it.
At the heart of the Electric Irish Homes textile project is a commitment to partnership and collaboration. Working with local communities is a key priority for the museum. The Electric Irish Homes textile project will form a key part of the Kitchen Power exhibition, which is due to open in July.
And it was July 2020. I had already, so this is the finished collaborative piece, which is what we had originally envisaged, that everybody would be making one piece, which is built off an awful lot of work in terms of narrative and reminiscence workshops. So this whole idea about going back and thinking about what are your memories of this time period, but also what are the, what images prompt memories, and how does that work? But then actually using those images and translating them into this textile collage. And there's some really fantastic bits in here. The whole thing works really well, but there's some really interesting details in it. You've got little turbines, wind turbines, the whole idea of electricity now being really important, but also then as well the textiles, including these tiny little Aran jumper and bloomers and socks. So the scale of what people were working on was going from really large and really small, and incredibly skilled. But again, this idea about being really experimental and using it to try and tell a story. And part of it is that everybody was doing these individual panel pieces as well, taking different elements of the story and putting them together in 2 dimensions, which started to creep into 3 dimensions as there's more sort of knitting and crochet involved in it. And everything from, there's the twin tub, the light, the GC cooker, the church lit up, the bog, the TV in the window, ESB changing rural Ireland, coming from these older objects to the newer ones, like the hairdryer, but then actually going into 3 dimensions. And this was something that we didn't expect at all, that was the members and the participants in the project taking this and running with it and going up making, these tiny little twin tubs and sewing machines and so on. And this one, which I think is possibly, I like this one a lot, because I think it encapsulates an awful lot of different parts of what we were trying to do, where it's that quote about it being like a light from heaven. It's showing the actual light and the white light on the blue background, but the heaven then with the angel symbol up on the top left hand side. But it's such an incredibly skilled piece, but there's a whole load of thought and narrative has gone into it as well. You know, what is the story that it's trying to tell? So it's a really great piece of art and craft as well, craft work. So it's what I've actually got here. This is the last slide, is just, this is the acknowledgements panel from the exhibition, which gives you an idea of the number of people that were involved with it, both in terms of the oral histories, the exhibition, and the textile project. And I just wanted to finish up by, you know, bringing this back around to thinking about the grassroots and activism and the craftivism, particularly in terms of the ICA, but other women's organizations as well, that, you know, part of what we were doing here was looking at people's memories, looking at narratives, looking at the power of objects, about the objects that had been kept from this period a few, you know, several decades ago, but of their activism, but also then being able to try and turn that into a type of craftivism as well, where we had the platform of the museum and the support of the museum and the AHRC in Kingston and so on, but the members of the textile project being able to take this and run with this and do something with it that was beyond our expectations and beyond what we were thinking about at the start. And, you know, this idea about living through an energy transition, which is something that I know an awful lot of the ICA there's interest in climate activism and sustainability in the countryside. That I think what's really interesting is this idea of, you know, looking at people's own guild history, but into not just thinking back in terms of the past, but in thinking in terms of the future. And this doesn't just apply to the ICA guilds, but any sort of organization or activist organization, about how do you use that activism and craftivism to make your work more visible now, but also for the groups of 50 or 100 years time. You know, what is the legacy that we're leaving of this activism for that future? So thank you.